What if I told you there was once a time when owning a cat could get you accused of witchcraft? When the simple act of feeding a stray tabby might brand you as a servant of Satan? When the church officially declared that these purring, whisker-twitching creatures were literally agents of hell sent to corrupt Christian souls? Welcome to medieval Europe, where humanity's relationship with cats became one of history's most bizarre and tragic misunderstandings. A 1,000-year war between Christianity and creatures whose only crime was being mysteriously, undeniably feline. Good evening, dear night wanderers. Welcome once again to our quiet corner of history, where we explore the stranger chapters of human experience at the gentle pace of a cat stretching in a patch of afternoon sunlight. Tonight, we'll pad softly through the shadowed monasteries and torchlit villages of medieval Europe, where the rustle of monks' robes mixed with whispered prayers, and where an entire civilization somehow convinced itself that the soft meow of a house cat was actually the voice of demons. Before we begin this peculiar journey through time, how about giving that like button a gentle tap? And if you haven't yet joined our community of curious insomniacs, the subscribe button awaits your attention like a patient cat waiting for dinner. In the comments below, tell us, what time is it where you're listening? And from which corner of the world are you joining us in this quiet hour? We love knowing that while you settle into comfort, we're all connected by this shared fascination with history's most inexplicable moments. Now, find your most comfortable position. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of our story. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow your mind to wander back to a time when the world was lit by candles and oil lamps, when the night was truly dark, and when the yellow eyes of cats gleaming in that darkness seemed to medieval minds like windows into something far more sinister than simple feline curiosity. Imagine yourself walking through a European village around the year 1200. The air carries the mingled scents of wood smoke, baking bread, and the earthy smell of unpaved streets. Church bells mark the hours with their bronze voices echoing off stone walls. And somewhere in the shadows between buildings, you catch a glimpse of movement, the fluid, silent passage of a cat, its presence somehow both comforting and, to the medieval mind, deeply unsettling. This is the story of how an entire civilization turned against one of nature's most elegant predators, how religious fervor transformed purring companions into instruments of evil, and how fear and superstition created one of history's most enduring and destructive prejudices. It's a tale that reveals as much about human nature as it does about cats, and perhaps more about the medieval soul than either. To understand why medieval Christians developed such a profound suspicion of cats, we must first journey back to the world from which Christianity emerged, a world where cats were not feared, but revered, worshipped, and considered sacred beings with direct connections to the divine. For the medieval church's hostility toward cats was not born in isolation. It was a deliberate rejection of everything cats had represented in the ancient pagan world. Picture, if you will, the sun-baked streets of ancient Egypt, where the sound of sandaled feet on stone mixed with the gentle tinkling of jewelry and the soft conversations of people going about their daily business. Here, in the markets and temples along the Nile, cats moved with the confidence of creatures who knew they were beloved by gods and humans alike. They basked on warm stone steps, accepted offerings of fish and milk, and were mourned in death with the same rituals reserved for human family members. In Egyptian religion, cats were sacred to Batet, the goddess of protection, fertility, and motherhood. Batet was often depicted as a woman with a cat's head, or simply as a cat adorned with golden jewelry, her eyes holding the wisdom of the divine. Temples dedicated to her housed hundreds of cats, cared for by priests who understood that to harm a cat was not just cruelty. It was sacrilege that could bring down the wrath of the gods. The reverence for cats in Egypt went far beyond simple religious symbolism. Cats were seen as creatures that existed simultaneously in the physical and spiritual worlds. Their ability to see in darkness was interpreted as the capacity to perceive spirits and otherworldly beings. Their silent movement suggested supernatural powers. Their independent nature was viewed as divine autonomy. Cats serve humans not out of subservience, but out of choice, which made their companionship all the more precious. When an Egyptian cat died, the family would shave their eyebrows in mourning and mummify the beloved animal with the same care given to human remains. Archaeologists have discovered vast cat cemeteries containing thousands of mummified felines, each wrapped in linen and placed in ornate sarcophagi, testament to a civilization that saw cats not as mere animals, but as sacred beings deserving of eternal respect. This Egyptian reverence for cats spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman cultures, while not worshipping cats as directly as the Egyptians did, nonetheless valued them highly for their practical and mystical qualities. Cats were associated with various deities of the hunt, the moon, and feminine wisdom. They were seen as creatures of good fortune, protectors of homes and families. Roman households often kept cats not just for pest control, but as beloved companions whose presence was thought to bring blessing and protection. Roman writers described cats with affection and respect, noting their intelligence, their cleanliness, and their mysterious ability to sense things beyond human perception. A cat in a Roman home was a sign of prosperity and divine favor. But as Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire, this ancient reverence for cats became a problem for the new faith. Early Christian theologians found themselves confronting a world filled with pagan symbols, practices, and beliefs that needed to be not just replaced, but actively rejected. And cats, with their deep connections to ancient goddess worship and pagan spirituality, became symbols of everything Christianity sought to overcome. The transformation was gradual but systematic. Early Christian writers began to reinterpret the very qualities that had made cats sacred to pagans as evidence of their sinister nature. The cat's ability to see in darkness, once viewed as divine insight, was now seen as proof of their alliance with the forces that dwelt in shadows. Their silent movement, previously admired as supernatural grace, was now interpreted as the stealth of creatures with something to hide. Most importantly, cats' association with feminine divinity became, in the eyes of early Christian authorities, evidence of their connection to the dangerous spiritual power that the Church was working to suppress. The goddess religions that had honored cats were precisely the belief systems that Christianity needed to eliminate in order to establish its dominance. This theological shift was reflected in the writings of early Church Fathers. Where pagan authors had described cats with admiration, Christian writers began to describe them with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. The independent nature that pagans had seen as divine autonomy, Christians began to interpret as defiance of proper authority. The nocturnal habits that had suggested mystical wisdom now suggested alliance with darkness itself. St. Augustine, one of the most influential early Christian theologians, wrote extensively about the need to reject pagan symbols and practices. While he didn't focus specifically on cats, his broader arguments about the spiritual dangers of pagan animal worship created an intellectual framework that later thinkers would apply directly to feline creatures. The Christianization of the Roman Empire accelerated this process. As pagan temples were closed or converted to churches, as goddess statues were destroyed or buried, the creatures associated with those deities found their status fundamentally altered. Cats, which had once moved through sacred spaces as honored guests, now found themselves viewed with increasing suspicion by the dominant religious authority. But the transformation went deeper than simple religious politics. Early Christianity was grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, about the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds, about the proper ordering of earthly existence under divine authority. In this theological context, cats presented a particular problem. Unlike dogs, which demonstrated clear submission to human authority and could easily be interpreted as models of proper Christian obedience, cats maintained their independence. They couldn't be trained to heel or fetch or perform on command. They chose when to show affection, when to hunt, when to appear or disappear. This independence, which had once been seen as divine autonomy, now appeared to Christian authorities as a rejection of the hierarchical order that God had supposedly established. Moreover, cats were increasingly associated with practices that the Church was working to suppress. The folk healers, wise women, and practitioners of traditional medicine who maintained some of the old pagan knowledge often kept cats as companions. These women, who would eventually be labeled as witches, found in cats creatures that shared their liminal existence, beings who moved between the domestic and wild worlds, who were comfortable in both daylight and darkness, who seemed to possess knowledge beyond ordinary understanding. The association between cats and these folk practitioners created a feedback loop of suspicion. As the Church became more hostile toward traditional healing practices and the women who maintained them, cats became guilty by association. And as cats became more suspect, the people who continued to value and care for them also became objects of suspicion. By the early medieval period, around 500 to 600 CE, this transformation was largely complete in the minds of Church authorities. Cats had been successfully rebranded from sacred beings worthy of reverence to dangerous creatures whose very nature suggested alliance with forces opposed to Christian salvation. But the intellectual framework for suspecting cats was just the beginning. The medieval period would see this theological suspicion transformed into active persecution, as cats became not just symbols of rejected paganism, but active agents of evil in an increasingly paranoid Christian worldview. The stage was set for one of history's most peculiar and tragic campaigns: the systematic persecution of creatures whose only crime was embodying a form of natural grace that medieval Christianity found threatening to its vision of proper spiritual order. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your modern bed tonight, surrounded by a world where cats are simply cats, neither gods nor demons, but creatures free to be themselves, consider the extraordinary journey that led from ancient reverence to medieval persecution. The same qualities that made cats sacred to Egyptians would soon make them targets of Christian suspicion. The transformation had begun, and the creatures that had once basked in temple sunlight would soon find themselves skulking in shadows, not by choice, but by necessity, as an entire civilization turned against them in the name of religious purity. But the true persecution was still to come, as medieval minds would find in cats evidence not just of pagan contamination, but of active demonic presence in the Christian world. As we continue our gentle exploration through the shadowed corridors of medieval thought, let us now examine how the learned men of the Church, those scholars who spent their days in candlelit scriptoriums copying manuscripts and their nights in prayer, managed to construct an elaborate theological case against creatures whose most threatening behavior was the occasional midnight yowl or stolen fish. Picture yourself in a medieval monastery around the year 1000, where the scratch of quill pens on parchment mingles with the soft chanting of Vespers prayers. The air smells of ink, candle wax, and the musty sweetness of old books. Here, in these quiet halls of learning, monks and scholars were engaged in what they considered the most important work of their age: understanding God's creation and identifying the forces that threatened Christian souls. These were men who approached the world with the systematic precision of theologians trained in the fine art of finding divine meaning in every aspect of earthly existence. They examined birds and found lessons about the soul's aspiration toward heaven. They studied flowers and discovered parables about spiritual growth. They observed the movements of stars and saw evidence of divine order governing all creation. But when they turned their scholarly attention to cats, something entirely different happened. Instead of finding divine lessons in feline behavior, they found what they believed to be evidence of deliberate opposition to God's intended order. The very characteristics that made cats successful predators and independent creatures struck these medieval minds as proof of their alliance with darker forces. Let us consider how methodically they built their case. Medieval scholars began with the cat's nocturnal nature, noting that while God had clearly intended day for work and worship, cats preferred the hours of darkness. This wasn't simply observed as natural behavior. It was interpreted as a theological statement. Cats, they reasoned, chose darkness over light, which in Christian symbolism could only mean they had chosen evil over good. The scholarly analysis became increasingly elaborate. They noted that cats' eyes reflected light in darkness, creating an eerie glow that seemed supernatural to medieval observers. Rather than understanding this as a natural adaptation for nocturnal hunting, they interpreted it as evidence that cats could literally see into the spiritual realm, specifically, into the realm of demons and evil spirits that were understood to inhabit darkness. Medieval bestiary texts, those illuminated manuscripts that catalogued God's creatures, began to describe cats in increasingly ominous terms. Where earlier Christian texts had simply ignored cats or mentioned them neutrally, medieval bestiaries described them as creatures whose very nature demonstrated spiritual corruption. They were said to be naturally aligned with forces opposed to divine order. The theological argument became particularly sophisticated when medieval scholars considered the cat's independence. In a hierarchical society where every creature was supposed to know its place in God's great chain of being, where dogs demonstrated proper submission to human authority, horses showed noble service, and sheep exhibited the meekness that Christians were supposed to emulate, cats seemed to reject the entire concept of proper submission. This independence was not seen as morally neutral, but as evidence of pride, which medieval theology identified as the first and greatest of sins. Pride was the sin that had caused Lucifer's fall from heaven, the fundamental rebellion against God's authority that had introduced evil into creation. When cats demonstrated independence from human control, medieval minds saw not natural behavior, but a reenactment of Satan's original rebellion against divine order. The scholarly case against cats became even more elaborate when theologians considered their hunting behavior. While other domesticated animals contributed clearly to human welfare, dogs guarded property, horses provided transportation, cattle gave milk and meat, cats killed creatures that seemed, to medieval observation, to pose little threat to human well-being. Why, scholars wondered, would God create creatures whose primary function seemed to be the unnecessary taking of life? This line of reasoning led to increasingly dark interpretations of feline behavior. The cat's patient stalking of prey was seen not as efficient hunting, but as evidence of cruel pleasure in causing suffering. The way cats sometimes played with wounded prey before killing it was interpreted as proof of their naturally sadistic inclinations, behavior that seemed to medieval minds remarkably similar to how demons were believed to torment souls. Medieval theologians also found theological significance in the cat's purr, that gentle rumbling sound that we now understand as an expression of contentment or a mechanism for self-healing. To medieval ears, particularly in the context of growing suspicion about cats, purring began to sound sinister, like the murmured incantations of sorcerers or the satisfied rumbling of demons pleased with their evil work. The scholarly interpretation of cat behavior became a kind of theological detective work, where every feline characteristic was examined for evidence of spiritual corruption. Cats groomed themselves extensively, which was interpreted not as cleanliness but as vanity, another of the deadly sins. They were selective in their affections, which was seen not as natural caution but as evidence of their calculating, manipulative nature. Even the cat's reproductive behavior was subjected to theological analysis. The loud vocalizations of cats in heat were interpreted as expressions of excessive lust, while their seasonal breeding patterns were seen as evidence of their enslavement to carnal desires. In a religious culture that increasingly valued celibacy and viewed sexual desire with deep suspicion, cats seemed to embody everything that good Christians were supposed to reject. But perhaps the most damning evidence, in medieval scholarly opinion, was the cat's association with women. As we mentioned in our first segment, cats had long been companions to the folk healers and wise women who maintained traditional knowledge about herbs, healing, and midwifery. These women, who operated outside the official channels of church-controlled learning, were increasingly viewed with suspicion by medieval authorities. The association between cats and these women was interpreted not as coincidental, but as evidence of spiritual kinship. Both cats and the women who cared for them seemed to operate according to their own rules rather than submitting to proper masculine, ecclesiastical authority. Both seemed to possess knowledge that came from sources outside official Christian learning. Both seemed comfortable with aspects of life, darkness, solitude, the mysteries of birth and healing, that made church authorities uncomfortable. Medieval scholars began to theorize that cats were attracted to women precisely because women were more susceptible to demonic influence. This wasn't seen as misogyny. Medieval theologians would have insisted they were simply observing spiritual truths about the different natures of men and women. Women, they believed, were naturally more emotional, more intuitive, more connected to the physical rather than spiritual realm, and therefore more vulnerable to the kinds of temptations that demons offered. Cats, according to this theological reasoning, recognized this vulnerability and sought out female companionship as a way of gaining access to human souls that were easier to corrupt. The fact that cats seemed to prefer the company of certain women, particularly those who lived alone, practiced traditional healing, or otherwise existed on the margins of conventional society, was seen as proof of their role as demonic agents. This theological framework created a self-reinforcing cycle of suspicion. As church authorities became more suspicious of independent women, they also became more suspicious of the cats associated with them. As they developed more elaborate theories about why cats were spiritually dangerous, they found more evidence to support their suspicions about the women who cared for cats. The scholarly case against cats was also reinforced by their supposed connections to heretical Christian sections. Various groups that the Church considered heretical, from the Cathars to the Waldensians to various mystical sects, were accused of using cats in their religious practices. Whether these accusations were true is largely irrelevant. What matters is that medieval church authorities believed them, and used these beliefs to further support their theological case against feline creatures. Some medieval texts claimed that heretical sects worshipped Satan in the form of a cat, or that they used cats in blasphemous parodies of Christian rituals. Others suggested that cats were present at heretical gatherings because demons inhabited feline bodies in order to witness and encourage activities that opposed true Christian faith. These accusations created a theological and legal framework that made cat ownership potentially dangerous. If cats were associated with heresy, then caring for cats might be seen as evidence of heretical sympathies. If cats were believed to be instruments of demonic influence, then allowing them into your home might be interpreted as willful invitation of evil forces. The cumulative effect of all this scholarly attention was to create an intellectual justification for what would become systematic persecution. Medieval theologians had successfully transformed cats from neutral creatures into active agents of evil, from natural predators into supernatural threats, from potential companions into spiritual enemies that good Christians were obligated to oppose. But the transformation from theological suspicion to active persecution required more than scholarly arguments. It required the development of popular beliefs, folk superstitions, and social practices that would make ordinary people fear and reject creatures they might otherwise have welcomed into their homes. As you rest comfortably tonight, perhaps with your own cat purring peacefully nearby, consider the extraordinary intellectual effort that medieval scholars invested in demonizing creatures whose actual behavior was simply feline. They had created an elaborate theological framework that interpreted every natural cat behavior as evidence of supernatural evil. The stage was now set for this scholarly suspicion to spread beyond monastery walls and into the daily lives of medieval people, where it would encounter folk beliefs, social anxieties, and popular fears that would transform theological theory into social persecution. As our nocturnal journey through medieval cat persecution continues, let us now venture beyond the scholarly halls of monasteries and universities into the bustling marketplaces, smoky taverns, and candlelit cottages where ordinary people lived their daily lives. For it was here, in the realm of folk belief and popular superstition, that the theological case against cats encountered the fertile soil of human anxiety and grew into something far more dangerous than academic theory. Picture yourself in a typical medieval village around 1200, where the day begins with church bells calling people to morning prayer and ends with the soft glow of rushlight candles flickering in small windows. This is a world where most people cannot read, where knowledge passes through stories rather than books, where the line between natural and supernatural explanation is fluid and constantly shifting. In this world, The scholarly arguments about cats' theological significance became transformed into something more immediate and personally threatening. Where monks and theologians saw cats as symbols of spiritual corruption, ordinary villagers began to see them as active agents of malevolent magic, creatures capable of bringing misfortune, illness, and even death to those who crossed them. The transformation from theological suspicion to folk fear was facilitated by the very real mysteries that surrounded cat behavior. Medieval people, lacking our modern understanding of animal biology and behavior, found cats genuinely puzzling in ways that fed naturally into supernatural explanations. Consider, for instance, the cat's remarkable ability to land on its feet when falling. To us, this is simply a natural reflex involving the inner ear and flexible spine. To medieval observers, it appeared to be evidence of supernatural protection. If cats could seemingly defy the natural laws that governed other creatures, what did that suggest about their true nature? Similarly, the cat's apparent ability to sense things that humans couldn't detect, reacting to sounds too faint for human hearing, seeming to watch invisible presences, becoming agitated before storms or earthquakes, was interpreted not as superior sensory capability, but as evidence of their connection to the spiritual realm. Medieval folk logic reasoned that if cats could perceive things beyond human senses, they must be in communication with otherworldly forces. The cat's nocturnal wanderings, which we now understand as natural territorial behavior, became the source of elaborate folk theories about their nighttime activities. Village gossips would note when cats disappeared after dark and spin increasingly elaborate tales about where they went and what they did. These stories often involved secret gatherings, supernatural meetings, or participation in malevolent activities that ordinary people could only imagine. These beliefs also created practical problems for people who needed cats for pest control. Medieval homes, barns, and granaries were constantly threatened by rats and mice, and cats were by far the most effective means of controlling these pests. But as cats became associated with supernatural threats, people found themselves in the uncomfortable position of needing creatures they had been taught to fear and distrust. Some communities developed elaborate folk rituals designed to purify cats so they could be safely kept for pest control. These might involve blessing ceremonies, the sprinkling of holy water, or other religious observances intended to counteract the supposedly evil influences that cats carried. Other communities tried to find alternatives to cats for pest control, with predictably unsuccessful results. The folk transformation of cats into supernatural threats was also influenced by their reproductive behavior, which medieval people found both fascinating and disturbing. The loud vocalizations of cats in heat, their seasonal mating patterns, and the independence of pregnant females struck medieval minds as evidence of their connection to forces that were both natural and somehow transgressive. Folk beliefs began to suggest that cats' reproductive cycles were connected to moon phases, seasonal celebrations, or other phenomena that the church associated with pagan practices. The fact that cats seemed to be most active sexually during certain times of year, coinciding with traditional pagan festivals that Christianity had tried to suppress, was seen as evidence of their ongoing connection to pre-Christian spiritual forces. Perhaps most importantly, the folk transformation of cats into supernatural threats created social pressure that affected how people related to these animals. In communities where cat ownership was associated with witchcraft, demonic activity, or heretical religious practices, keeping cats became a socially dangerous act that could subject individuals to suspicion, gossip, and potentially more serious consequences. The cumulative effect of these folk beliefs was to create communities where cats were simultaneously needed and feared, where their practical benefits were overshadowed by their supposed supernatural threats, where caring for these animals became an act that required justification and caution. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your modern world, where cats are simply valued companions rather than supernatural threats, consider how the combination of scholarly suspicion and folk fear created a perfect storm of anti-feline sentiment. The theologians had provided the intellectual framework, popular culture had provided the emotional conviction, social pressure had provided the enforcement mechanism. The stage was now set for this combination of learned theory and popular belief to encounter the ultimate catalyst for persecution: the growing medieval obsession with witchcraft, heresy, and the supposed presence of Satan's agents in the Christian world. What had begun as theological suspicion and folk fear was about to become systematic persecution, as cats found themselves at the center of the medieval church's battle against what it perceived as the forces of evil itself. As we approach the culmination of our gentle journey through medieval cat persecution, let us now explore how centuries of theological suspicion and folk fear crystallized into systematic campaigns against these creatures, and how those campaigns created consequences that would echo through European history for generations to come. Picture yourself in the year 1233, when Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull called Vox in Rama, a document that would transform scattered suspicions about cats into official church policy. The papal chamber where this decree was drafted was a place of solemn ceremony, where the scratch of quill pens on parchment carried the weight of divine authority, and where decisions made in candlelit consultation would affect millions of lives across Christian Europe. Vox in Rama was ostensibly about combating heresy, specifically targeting a sect called the Luciferians who were accused of worshipping Satan. But buried within its theological condemnations was a description of heretical practices that included the ritualistic worship of cats, specifically, a large black cat that was said to be Satan himself in animal form. The bull described elaborate ceremonies where heretics would kiss the satanic cat, participate in orgies, and engage in other activities that the church considered blasphemous. Whether these practices actually existed is less important than the fact that the highest authority in medieval Christianity had now officially declared cats to be instruments of Satan. The papal bull gave ecclesiastical sanction to what had previously been folk belief and scholarly theory. Suddenly, suspicion of cats wasn't just popular superstition, it was church doctrine. The impact was swift and devastating. Across Europe, local church authorities began organizing campaigns to eliminate cats from Christian communities. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of popular violence, but systematic efforts backed by religious authority and often supported by secular law. Towns and villages that had previously tolerated or even welcomed cats now found themselves under pressure to prove their Christian devotion by eliminating these supposed agents of Satan. The persecution took many forms, some official and some spontaneous. In some regions, church authorities organized what they called purification campaigns, where groups of clergy and faithful would go from house to house searching for cats and confiscating them for destruction. These campaigns were conducted with the same solemnity as religious processions, complete with prayers, hymns, and ceremonial elements designed to emphasize the spiritual importance of the work being done. Other communities developed ritualized forms of cat killing that were incorporated into religious festivals. The most infamous of these occurred in France, where cats were burned alive during midsummer celebrations, ceremonies that were attended by nobility, blessed by clergy, and considered acts of communal devotion. These weren't barbaric displays of cruelty, in the medieval mind, but solemn religious observances designed to protect the community from supernatural threats. The town of Metz, for instance, developed an annual tradition where hundreds of cats were collected throughout the year and then burned alive in a great bonfire during the feast of St. John. The ceremony was presided over by local church authorities and attended by the entire community as a form of collective spiritual cleansing. Similar ceremonies developed across France, Germany, and other regions where anti-cat sentiment had taken deep root. But perhaps more devastating than these dramatic public ceremonies was the steady, everyday persecution that cats faced as medieval communities turned against them. People who had previously welcomed cats into their homes now drove them away. Farmers who had relied on cats for pest control now viewed them as spiritual threats to be eliminated rather than practical allies to be maintained. The social pressure against cat ownership became intense in many communities. People who continued to care for cats found themselves subject to suspicion, gossip, and sometimes formal accusations of witchcraft or heresy. The association between cats and supernatural evil had become so strong that cat ownership itself was seen as evidence of spiritual corruption. This created particularly difficult situations for the women who had traditionally served as healers, midwives, and practitioners of folk medicine. Many of these women had kept cats not just for companionship, but because the cat's hunting abilities helped protect the herbs and medicinal supplies that were essential to their work. But as cats became associated with witchcraft, these women found themselves forced to choose between practical necessity and social safety. Many chose to abandon their cats rather than risk accusation. Others tried to hide their relationships with feline companions, feeding them secretly and denying ownership when questioned. Some attempted to justify their cat keeping by emphasizing the practical benefits while downplaying any suggestion of affection or spiritual connection. The persecution of cats was also facilitated by changes in medieval economic and social structures. As European society became more urbanized and centralized, traditional forms of pest control became less important to many people. City dwellers who bought their food in markets rather than storing grain in rural barns had less immediate need for cats' hunting services. This reduced practical dependence on cats made it easier for communities to abandon them in favor of spiritual purity. The campaign against cats was also supported by the development of alternative pest control methods. Some communities experimented with poisons, though these were often more dangerous to humans than effective against rodents. Others tried to control rodent populations through trapping, though this proved far less efficient than natural feline predation. The reduced effectiveness of these alternative methods was often attributed to supernatural interference rather than practical limitations, which sometimes led to renewed suspicion of cats even in communities that had supposedly eliminated them. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the medieval persecution of cats was how it affected the women who were most vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Elderly widows, herbalists, midwives, and other women who lived on the margins of medieval society often found that their previous relationships with cats were used as evidence against them in formal accusations of supernatural wrongdoing. The logic was circular but devastating. Cats were associated with witchcraft, so women who had kept cats were suspected of being witches. But witches were known to keep cats, so the presence of cats in a woman's past became evidence of her supernatural activities. Many women found that their previous kindness to stray cats, their success in training cats for pest control, or even their ability to attract cat companionship were all reinterpreted as evidence of their involvement with demonic forces. The persecution of cats thus became intertwined with the broader medieval campaigns against witchcraft and heresy. As accusations of supernatural wrongdoing became more common and more severe, cats found themselves not just persecuted in their own right, but used as evidence in human trials that often ended in torture, imprisonment, or execution. The economic consequences of cat persecution were also significant, though they took time to become apparent. As cat populations declined across Europe, rodent populations began to increase dramatically. Granaries that had previously been protected by resident cat populations now suffered significant losses to rats and mice. The decline in stored food contributed to periodic famines and made communities more vulnerable to the kinds of economic disruptions that could trigger social unrest. Some historians argue that the medieval persecution of cats contributed indirectly to the severity of the Black Death pandemic in the 14th century. While cats don't hunt the rats that carried plague-infected fleas, they do hunt the smaller rodents that compete with rats for food sources. The decline in cat populations may have created more favorable conditions for the rat populations that would eventually carry plague across Europe. Whether or not cats could have prevented the plague, their absence certainly made European communities more vulnerable to the economic and social disruptions caused by rodent damage to food supplies. Communities that had previously maintained stable food stores found themselves dealing with unprecedented levels of pest damage, which contributed to the kinds of malnutrition and social stress that made populations more vulnerable to disease. The persecution of cats also had cultural consequences that extended far beyond practical considerations. Medieval European society lost much of the folk knowledge about animal behavior, natural pest control, and the practical benefits of human-animal relationships that had been maintained by the people who had traditionally cared for cats. The systematic elimination of cats from Christian communities represented a broader rejection of the kind of practical, observational knowledge about the natural world that had been maintained by folk healers, herbalists, and other practitioners of traditional wisdom. This knowledge was replaced by theological interpretations of natural phenomena that were often less accurate and less useful for practical purposes. But perhaps most importantly, the persecution of cats revealed something troubling about medieval Christian society's relationship with the natural world. The campaign against cats was part of a broader trend toward viewing nature not as God's creation to be appreciated and cared for, but as a collection of symbols to be interpreted for theological significance and potential spiritual threats to be eliminated. This theological approach to the natural world created a framework where practical relationships with animals were subordinated to abstract religious concerns. The real benefits that cats provided to human communities, pest control, companionship, and the simple pleasure of interacting with graceful, intelligent creatures, were sacrificed to the theoretical spiritual benefits of eliminating supposed supernatural threats. The persecution reached its peak during the 13th and 14th centuries, but it continued in various forms well into the early modern period. Even as some communities began to recognize the practical benefits of cat populations, the association between cats and supernatural evil remained strong enough to limit their acceptance in Christian society. It wasn't until the gradual decline of witchcraft prosecutions and the rise of more secular approaches to natural phenomena that cats began to regain acceptance in European society. The process was slow and uneven, with some regions maintaining suspicion of cats well into the 18th century. As you rest comfortably tonight in a world where cats are beloved companions rather than suspected demons, consider the extraordinary social transformation that this persecution represented. An entire civilization had convinced itself that creatures whose actual behavior was simply feline represented supernatural threats requiring systematic elimination. The medieval persecution of cats stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of how theological theory, popular superstition, and social pressure can combine to create mass campaigns against completely innocent targets. It reveals the power of authority to shape popular perception, the danger of interpreting natural phenomena through exclusively religious lenses, and the tragic consequences when fear becomes policy and superstition becomes law. But it also reveals something hopeful about human nature. Eventually, practical necessity and simple observation overcame even the most elaborate theological justifications for persecution. Cats survived, their populations recovered, and they eventually reclaimed their place as valued members of human communities. The great persecution had ended, but its lessons about the danger of demonizing the different, the innocent, and the misunderstood would echo through history long after the last medieval bonfire had burned out. And so we come to the gentle end of our nocturnal journey through one of history's most peculiar chapters, the strange tale of how an entire civilization convinced itself that purring, whisker-twitching creatures were agents of supernatural evil, and how those same creatures eventually found their way back into human hearts despite centuries of persecution. As you settle into the final moments of our story tonight, perhaps with your own cat curled peacefully nearby, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable distance between our medieval ancestors' world and your own. You live in a time when cats are not demons to be feared, but companions to be cherished. When their mysterious nighttime wanderings suggest not supernatural meetings but simple territorial patrols. When their independent nature is seen not as prideful rebellion against divine order, but as one of the most endearing aspects of feline personality. The journey from medieval suspicion to modern acceptance was neither quick nor simple. It required centuries of gradual change in how humans understood both the natural world and their place within it. It required the slow decline of the kind of theological thinking that interpreted every natural phenomenon as a supernatural symbol. It required communities to rediscover through practical necessity what they had lost through religious fear. The simple truth that cats are remarkable hunters, engaging companions, and creatures worthy of respect and affection. Perhaps most remarkably, cats themselves played a role in their own rehabilitation. No amount of persecution could eliminate their essential feline nature, their grace, their intelligence, their capacity for both independence and affection. Even in communities where cats were officially banned, stray cats continued to appear, continued to hunt rodents with devastating efficiency, continued to seek human companionship with the persistent optimism that seems to characterize their species. Gradually, practically quietly, cats won back human acceptance not through theological argument or official decree, but simply by being themselves. Their purrs proved more persuasive than any scholarly treatise. Their effectiveness against pests proved more convincing than any religious doctrine. Their capacity for companionship proved more powerful than any superstitious fear. The medieval persecution of cats teaches us something important about both human nature and historical change. It shows us how easily fear and superstition can overwhelm practical experience, how readily communities can turn against innocent creatures when authorities provide justification for doing so. But it also shows us the ultimate power of direct experience to overcome even the most elaborate theoretical frameworks. Medieval people eventually rediscovered what their ancient ancestors had known, that cats are not supernatural beings, either divine or demonic, but natural creatures whose behaviors can be understood through observation rather than theological interpretation. They learned again that the mysterious is not necessarily the malevolent, that independence is not the same as evil, and that creatures who live by their own rules are not necessarily opponents of human welfare. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful sleep in a world where cats are free to be cats, neither gods nor demons, but simply themselves, you can rest in the knowledge that even the most powerful forces of fear and superstition cannot permanently overcome the simple truth of direct, loving experience. The great medieval persecution of cats ended not because church authorities issued new decrees or scholars developed better theories, but because individual humans, one by one, rediscovered the pleasure of sharing their lives with these remarkable creatures. Love conquered fear, practical experience overcame theological abstraction, and cats found their way home to human hearts where they had always belonged. Sweet dreams, dear listeners. May your sleep be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may any cats in your life continue to enjoy the acceptance and affection that their medieval ancestors were so tragically denied. The purr of redemption echoes still, a gentle rumbling reminder that truth, patience, and the simple persistence of being oneself can overcome even the most elaborate campaigns of fear and misunderstanding. Good night.